Well, Thanksgiving is upon us, and people will be enjoying turkey and food and all the things that come with the holiday. But the history of the holiday, the pilgrims coming to America, there's so much to break down. You actually wrote a book a few years back, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century and How the Pilgrims Escaped It, the prequel to America's Freedom. We'll talk about that. But let's actually start with, what do you think people lose? What sort of myths do you think are out there when it comes to discussions around the pilgrims? Because it does feel like there's a lot of confusion.
Right. Well, I actually wrote a book on socialism, and there is a tactic called deconstruction, where you go into a country and you want to erase their history. You say negative things about the founders of the country, so that people emotionally detach from them. They took land from Indians, sold people into slavery, and ooh, they're repulsed. Now you have the students in a neutral, they're open-minded. What are all the belief systems? Let's do comparative religions. And then they give their pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islamism or whatever. And it's used throughout history. China, 3rd century BC, the Warring States period. There's a half a dozen kingdoms. One wins led by Qin Shi Huangdi. And he was criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. So he decided to destroy all records of how things were done before. French Revolution, they tore down the statues of good King Henry IV and dug up the grave of St. Genevieve and wanted to destroy the past. Communism, they renamed St. Petersburg Leningrad. So there's always this effort of coming in and erasing the history so that they can bring in their new idea. And that's what's happened in America with the Pilgrims. Right? They wanted to rewrite the history and make the people that founded the country, which we have more individual liberty and opportunity than any other nation in world history, but they want to get rid of that. And so they have to go back and sort of the George Orwell 1984, rewrite the history to make the good people into the bad people so that the students will emotionally detach from them.
So, I mean, talk a little bit about the pilgrims. Who were they? What were they? We know, obviously, the narrative is that they're fleeing for religious liberty. I think about how scary it must have been to get on a ship and go all the way across the water to a world they had never been to. But talk a little bit about who they were and what the context for their voyage to America was.
So, big picture, you had the Muslims conquering North Africa, conquering the Holy Land, conquering into Turkey. You had the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent surrounding Vienna, Austria, 1529. And then the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571. And so you had this Islamic threat, and who's the hero fighting them is the King of Spain. He's taking the gold from the New World to fit out his navy to fight this Ottoman expansion. Well, after winning the Battle of Lepanto, rather than freeing the rest of the Mediterranean from Ottoman control, in 1572, the King of Spain sends the Iron Duke of Alba to squash the Reformation in the Netherlands, called the Spanish Fury. He kills 10,000 in Antwerp, Holland. Same year, 1572, the Queen of France does not like the fact that 10% of France is Huguenot Protestant, and she kills 30,000 in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And then you have England, and Henry VIII breaks from Rome, but then he kills the Catholic Sir Thomas More. He kills William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English. And so in England, it was whatever the king believed the kingdom had to believe. And so you couldn't even make up your own prayers. They had the Book of Common Prayer. And if you were caught making up your own prayers, your house was raided by their version of the FBI, and you were dragged before the Star Chamber, sort of a J6 hearing type of situation, had stars on the ceiling. And they would cut off your ear and brand you on the face as a heretic if you were caught believing something different than the king. So it was serious. And so the Pilgrims were one of these separatist groups. They did not belong to the Anglican bishop top-down church. They had what's called a covenant structure for a church model. Goes back to Jesus, upon this rock I'll build my ecclesia, and then goes back to the 400 years where Israel did not have a king, called the Assembly of the Israelites. The king didn't like this. He said, I will make them conform themselves, or I will harry them out of the land. And so there are several stories of the Pilgrims and what they went through in England. If you like, I can share a couple of those.
Yeah, I would love to hear at least one of those, because I think it helps bring home these themes that so many people have heard. You hear them in school, but they're very benign, and we really don't get a chance to hear the real nitty gritty of what they were going through.
So the Puritans were inside of the Anglican Church wanting to purify it, but the separatists separated themselves. And they would meet in barns by candlelight at nighttime. And we call the separatists pilgrims. They were basically Baptists, and they branched off of John Smith and Thomas Helwise, who started the first Baptist church in England. And so these separatists had a congregational covenant church model. They met in the home of William Brewster, a wealthy person that had a manor in Scrooby, England, but neighbors would snitch. And the police would bust into the house and raid them and drag them to jail. And they would get punished and have to come out again. It would happen again and again. Finally, some of these Pilgrim separatists decided to sell their property and go down to the port and buy passage for a ship to take them to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands were 7 provinces. They didn't always agree, but they were willing to work together against the King of Spain. It was an 80-year war of independence for the Netherlands to break away from Spain. So they had a little give and take, a little tolerance. The Netherlands were the number 1 most tolerant place in all of Europe. But right before the ship took off with the Pilgrims, the captain robbed them and turned them over to the police as heretics, and they were put in jail. So another group of these Pilgrim separatists arranged for a Dutch ship to sail up the coast, and they would be waiting in little rowboats, and they'd hurry up and row out and get on, but the Pilgrims showed up a day early. And the waves were really strong, and the kids are getting sick, and the women say, "Can we just wait on the shore with the kids?" And while the men are stowing the supplies on this Dutch ship, someone snitched, and the police come over the hill and arrest the women and children. And the Dutch captain says, "I don't have an army with me." And he pulls anchor and sails away with the men. You can just imagine these women and children standing there watching the boat getting smaller and smaller until it disappears. For 2 years, they pass these women and children from one court in England to another, one jail to another. Finally, a judge says, "You really didn't do anything wrong, go home." They go, "Duh, we sold our homes." So just to get them out of their hair, they put them on a boat, send them to the Netherlands, and they ask around, "Do you know anybody that speaks English?" And they finally find their husbands. And so there's a happy ending to that chapter. They settled in
Wow.
Leiden, Holland, which is where the Jews were. So the most populous Jewish area outside of the Holy Land after the Great Dispersion was Spain. They were called Sephardic Jews, and they survived for centuries, but then King Ferdinand decided to make them convert or leave. Some converted, they're called Morenos or New Christians, and but some fled back to the Ottoman Empire, some fled to Recife, South America, and some fled to the Netherlands. And they settled in Leiden, Holland, and that's where they met the Pilgrims. And so from this point on, the Pilgrims began identifying themselves with the Jews, saying, "You left the Pharaoh, we left the King of England. You crossed the Red Sea, we crossed the English Channel.
Oh,
You got
wow.
your promised land. We're looking for our promised land." And so that's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And anyway, Spain threatens to attack, and the Pilgrims decide to leave. They were going to go to Guyana, South America, but because they heard of the perpetual spring, but they said it's too close to the Spanish Main. That's the area of the Caribbean controlled by Spain. Why? A couple years earlier, 1565, some French Protestant Huguenots tried to settle Fort Caroline around what's today Jacksonville, Florida. And the Spanish found out about it and butchered them, like 300 of the men, and then took the women and children away. And so the Pilgrims like, "We don't want to go anywhere near Spain." And so they decide on Virginia, which was named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, founded 14 years earlier. It was a king-run colony, but they thought they would be 3,000 miles away and nobody would notice. And so then they set sail. As you mentioned, it's a little bitty boat, 66-day journey. The Pilgrims are confined to the between deck, a little 4-foot high space for 66 days. It's not a cruise boat, right? There's no,
Wow.
privacy. I mean, it's the rocking back and forth, and it's a stormy North Atlantic. One of
But
their
what people will do for freedom, right? I mean, that's what's so interesting about this. What you're willing to go through and do. We don't know anything about that in America compared to what people like this have had to go through. And there are people around the world today going through similar things. But I just want to emphasize that a 4-foot high, I mean, that's crazy. And a 66-day journey. But they go on this journey looking for hope, looking for freedom.
Yeah, and the boat's rocking back and forth. It's freezing, the North Atlantic. One guy, John Howland, goes up topside to get some fresh air right when a freezing wave swept the deck, knocks him overboard. But the ship was tilting and a rope was dragging, and he caught it, and they pulled him back in, and he ended up, having descendants that included, lots of famous Americans, and uh, so they had the main beam crack that held up the mast, and they had a screw which they think it was used for propping up the corner of a house, like when you're building a house. They put it under there and put the beam back in place, and anyway, they get to the shores of America, and they're 500 miles away from Virginia. They try sailing south. It's stormy. They almost sink. Over 3,000 ships have sunk off the coast of Cape Cod. And so the captain says, too dangerous, goes back to Plymouth Rock and says, off the boat. And the Pilgrims are like, we have a question. Who's going to be in charge? There's 102 of us in the boat. Nobody's been picked by the king to be in charge. We just can't get off and be totally lawless. They do something unique that we remember them for. They take their covenant church form of government and they make it their civil government. We, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic. That in the womb of the Mayflowers conceived this child of self-government. It's not a top-down rule by kings and all the kings appointed people. It's ruled bottom-up by just the 102 of us, right? We're going to covenant together before God. We're going to make laws and submit to him. And that became the model for the other New England colonies, eventually the U.S. Constitution. And the word federal is Latin for covenant. We have a covenant form of government in America that came from the Pilgrims and Puritans, that came from the Bible, what part of the Bible that first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. So that's why we always look to the Pilgrims as the beginning of self-government in America versus Virginia, which was a king-run colony. And then there's the story of Squanto. If you want, I can share that briefly.
Yes, yeah. Tell us that one.
So half the Pilgrims died the first winter. So now they're down to just around 50. And the next spring, out of the woods comes an Indian speaking to them in broken English, tells them about another Indian that could speak English better themselves. And he says, 4 or 5 days after comes Squanto. And they pieced together the story. The Pilgrims were religious, but not everybody else was. And so you had Spain, had a century of gold from, the Potosi mine in, Inca, Peru. They had gold from Latin South America, and they were bringing it through Portobello, Panama, to Cuba, to the New World. And you had pirates. You had English pirates, Henry Morgan. You had French pirates, Pegleg, Leclerc, and Dutch pirates. And some of these pirate type people would sail up the coast, lure natives onto the boat, lock them below deck, sail over to Malaga, Spain, and sell them into slavery, make a few bucks, right? And that's what happened to Squanto. And so some monks heard about him and made a big ruckus over in Spain to get these natives freed. One of them is Squanto. He finds his way across Europe, and then he gets to England, and he learns the language, and he works all these odd jobs. He's working there for a decade. This Indian, he finally finds a business that does sailing and merchant and fishing, and they drop him off in Newfoundland, and then finally drop him off in his homeland there along Cape Cod, only to find everybody was dead. A plague had swept through. Evidently, a French ship had shipwrecked there a couple years earlier. And William Bradford says the Indians never left watching them and dogging them till they got the advantage, killed them all but 3 or 4, whom they sent from one sachem chief to another, making sport with them, using them worse than slaves. Evidently, one of them had an illness, and the Indians caught it and wiped out the tribe. So Squanto, in a sort of backward sense, had he not been kidnapped, he most certainly would have died. So it's one of those type of situations. Sometimes things bad happen in our life, but we have to just trust the Lord. And so he's living with a neighboring tribe, the Wampanoag. And you can just imagine his Indian friend coming in his teepee saying, "Hey, Squant, you wouldn't believe it. There's a bunch of English people wanting to start a settlement on your old stomping ground." And so he shows up, and you imagine the dismay on the Pilgrims. Here they are, uh, barely survived the past winter, and out of the woods comes an Indian speaking to them in perfect English. Oh, you guys from England, London? Yeah, I used to live there. Oh, yeah, St. Paul's Chapel, and Wharf Street, and oh, this place. I grew up here. He knew that like the back of his hand. Over the hill is a spring, and he teaches them how to catch fish. They said we tried. He goes, no, these are salmon. They spawn looking at the moon. In a couple of weeks, this river will be packed. He teaches them how to plant corn. They said we tried it. He goes, no, you got to take a dead fish and put it over the corn kernel, guard it for 2 weeks to keep the wolves away. The fish decomposes, and then he taught him how to take corn and shake it in a pot over a fire and make popcorn. Teaches him how to go
Wow.
down to the riverbanks, squeegee in the mud and catch eels. And then William Bradford says, neither was there a man among them who had ever seen a beaver skin till instructed by Squanto. It took 40 years of beaver skins to pay off the debt for the boat ride. We never ask ourselves the question, who's paying for the Pilgrims boat ride? They had to borrow money. And then Squanto put them on good terms with the other Indians, and that's when you had the first Thanksgiving. You had Chief Massasoit come with 90 Indians. There were twice as many Indians at the first Thanksgiving than there were Pilgrims. And it was on the first street in America there in Massachusetts, outside of Jamestown. And so the first Thanksgiving went on for a day. At the end of the day, the Indians roll up in their blankets, go to sleep. Then they're there the second day. So it goes on a second day. At the end of the day, they roll up in their blankets, go to sleep, and then they go on for a third day. So the first Thanksgiving went on for 3 days. And so it's just a wonderful story of courage and faith. And that's the beginning of self-government. That's why we look back to the Pilgrims.
A lot of the negative, and we don't have a lot of time here. I wish we had an hour and a half to go through this, because a lot of the negative then comes in. You'll hear critics say, but look what happened to the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. It isn't this nice story. It isn't this nice. And again, we have this tendency to focus, as you were saying earlier, on all of these negative things. Human beings are sinful. Sin happens. But there's so much to this story, as you just unpacked, that is incredibly fascinating. People who traveled across the world to find freedom. Talk a little bit about that, how you respond to those who look at the Thanksgiving story and say, no, 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 this actually isn't a positive story.
Pre-Columbus, what were the Indians doing to each other? Well, in Mexico, the Aztecs were capturing the other tribes and bringing them to the top of their pyramids and ripping out their beating heart to the sun god and letting their bodies roll down the pyramid where the people would cannibalize them. This was thought to be a story that Cortez's men made up until 2015. They were excavating underneath a building in Mexico City, and they found thousands of skulls arranged in like a theater type setting. They keep uncovering them, and these even included women and children. They were not captives of war. These were ritual sacrifices taking place. They also had a game, right? The Mayans had sort of like soccer, but they'd kick a ball through a sort of a stone hoop. Well, guess what? The losing team all got killed. You had in North America, the Cheyenne Indians. They would be wiping out the other tribes. Many times, every single year, Indians would go on raiding parties and would raid other tribes and take away their women and children. And then you had the identity of the woman was tied together with the man, and there were many stories. If the husband died, the woman would be put out, and she'd be in the winter crying outside of the teepees, and everybody would just let her starve to death. Even the French missionaries talk about being tied up to poles, and they would eat off the meat off their hands while they were still alive, watching them do it. It was not a really peaceful place, like we're trying to be told. And so you had the Spanish go down in Latin South America, from Columbus, 1492. But we got a whole century. Now we're up to 1620 and the Pilgrims coming. And so the Pilgrims got along with the Indians. They had a peace that went on for several generations. You had William Penn in Pennsylvania. He insisted on paying a fair price for the land, and he made it in Pennsylvania, where if there was a conflict between an Indian and a settler, there was to be a jury of 12, with 6 of them being Indians in the jury. And they even had an instance where they found the settler at fault and they killed him. They executed judgment. And so they found that when you treat them fairly, they had peace. And so Pennsylvania, William Penn, they had peace compared to Virginia and some of the other colonies. So, yes, there was mistreatment. We don't want to go over that, but it was not the idyllic paradise that those with a deconstructionist socialist agenda try to paint.
Well, and the history of humanity is one group fighting another. I don't want to oversit, you're a historian, you would know better, but one group fighting another for land and for, I mean, this is what every country, every area of the world has had, which is battles over land and areas. And that has been the history of humanity in so many ways. So this idea that this only happened in America is almost a strange idea because it's happened across the world, has it not? I mean, this is a part of sin and humanity.
Yeah, Jared Diamond wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. He was an anthropologist, and he studied cultures all around the world. And he found that first was hunter gatherers, and even the Bible has Adam and Eve plucking the fruit off the tree, gathering. And then he says they went to agriculture. And of course, Cain was a tiller of the soil. But once people groups moved to agriculture, they could save up food and they would be able to wage war. They would deforest and then deplete the soil. So they would need to expand and they would end up coming up with tools for farming that would be transitioned into weapons. And basically, he draws the conclusion that agricultural people end up wiping out hunter-gatherer peoples. And he talks about stories in Africa, in Indonesia, and Asia. He talks about those the areas that had domesticable grains like wheat and barley versus North Africa that had fruits, that vegetables, but they couldn't keep. He talked about domesticable animals like horses and goats and oxen, where in North Africa they had gazelles that run, 60 miles an hour. How can you harness one of those? India had wild buffalo and maybe elephants, but they're hard to domesticate. America, they had dogs. I mean, maybe in South America, the llamas, but they had no horses. They didn't even invent the wheel. I mean, because there was plenty, so they didn't need to make these advances. But China invented the wheel, like for a wheelbarrow, back around the second century. But when the Spaniards come to the New World, the Native Americans didn't have a written language. They didn't know how to smelt iron and steel. In other words, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Chinese, the rest of the world all had written languages. They had steel, they had gunpowder, they had cannons. Somebody, and not to their own fault, but in America, it was still hunter-gatherers, killing deer, gathering, cranberries and stuff. So somebody was going to conquer the New World. Could have been Islam, could have been, but it just happened to have been the Northern Europeans.
Well, we have to run here. We have literally 30 seconds, but what is the message you would give people at Thanksgiving about why we should be thankful for America?
So America is an experiment of self-government where rights come from a creator, not from a king, and that you have freedom. You have freedom of conscience, that you can believe something other than the government. Wow. And you don't have to fear being canceled by the government if you don't agree with the government. You can have freedom of speech, freedom of press. You can post what you want on the internet without fear of having your house raided. So we have freedoms of expression in America that the rest of the world to this day even does not have. So we need to be if you like having freedom and you like expressing yourself and being able to go to church or not go to church if you want, you need to be thankful for the freedoms that we trace back to these pilgrims.
All right, The Treacherous World of the 16th Century and How the Pilgrims Escaped It. You also have a new book, Silence Equals Consent, The Sin of Omission, Speak Now or Forever Lose Your Freedom. We'll have you back to talk about that book as well. Appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you, and happy Thanksgiving to all the viewers.